Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, joined by I was about to call him a motley crew, but that's not fair at all to call him a motley crew, a fun crew. Alexis is joining us. I've got Dylan, I've got Eric Rush, and of course me. So we're going to be the four horsemen of something here in the next hour or so. When we get into it, we'll see where it goes. So really quick, I'll let people introduce themselves by voice. It's been a while for Alexis, so good to have her be able to join us today. So Lex, you get co-founders rights and you get to go first. How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, it has been a while. Hi, everyone.
Hi. I have the benefit of being able to see her here. Of course, I already know what she looks like, so I sort of had a role in that. But I know she's sitting in the rocking chair that will be the rocking chair that she uses to rock my grandson in, and that's an event that's coming here pretty soon. So I'm looking forward to that. From
Not
Memphis,
freaking out about that at all.
no, not a bit. And although he's from Memphis, he's wearing a Baylor shirt today. I know that's courtesy of his fiance. So Dylan, good to have you here.
Hey, it's good to be back.
Yeah, and there's Mr. Eric Rush over my lower right. Eric, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Don.
Good.
A pleasure.
We decided to take a little bit more of the whimsical kind of approach. We've been doing that here a little bit later. We're also, in some ways, these are sort of one-off filler episodes for some things that we've been loading up in the pipeline and really want full participation for. So if you like this topic today, I will take credit for it. If you don't like it, Robert's not here, so we'll blame him. But actually, I guess I'll take the blame for it as well. And my concept is sort of a little bit of a reverse what if, in the sense of we're going to talk about something that didn't happen but could have happened and what would have happened if it had happened, kind of thing. So it's a little bit of a different take on what's here. And my motivation for this seems like over the last couple of weeks, I've just seen a lot of articles, and certainly over the last couple of months, seen a lot of things about what we now call UAPs, which sounds a little bit strange. It's unidentified aerial phenomena, I think, is what that's supposed to represent. But when I was growing up, we had a very different term for those. And what was that, guys?
UFOs.
Yeah, unidentified flying objects. So now we can't even just say for sure they're objects. They're just phenomena, apparently. That's one of the changes that's here. And one of the things that definitely has been congressional hearings, all kinds of other stuff over the last couple of years. This has come out to be more in the government actually being, I guess, more transparent might be a word that you might use to describe it. Certainly more open about this, at least in terms of the public hearings. And so the historical what if for today is going to be going back to 1947, the incident that we often think about when we think about UFOs, which is the Roswell Incident. And the twist is going to be, instead of it being what we think that it is today, based upon what's been declassified and revealed, which was there was a program called Mogul that was releasing balloons that were being used to test for, I guess, nuclear tests and detect other things as well, spy work as well. But that instead of it being that, and a quote unquote weather balloon, that we actually did capture some type of crashed spacecraft. And instead of keeping that secret, that it was made public. So our what if today is what would be the case? How would things have been different if in 1947, maybe not knowing a lot about what we have, but suddenly it was not speculation in the public arena about the existence of alien spacecraft, alien technology, but it was publicly acknowledged and what might have happened. I think it's an interesting era because it's before the Cold War really kicks in. I mean, the Cold War exists because World War II is over and the tensions are building between the Soviet Union and the United States. But it's also still in that period of time that's not too far down the path. So again, I'm throwing that out as a concept today. And Alex, I'm going to throw to you first. Do you have any thoughts just generally about the concept? Then I'll swing on to Eric and then let Dylan have a say before we start going down the speculative path.
I mean, the first thing that pops in my head is just like, of all the things we could be having congressional hearings about, this is what we're having congressional hearings about. Like, this is top priority right now. That's me being my cynical self. And we'll probably get into to this a little bit too. We talked a little bit about a podcast about the fact that I do have a journalism degree, my journalism background. So that whole thing about like, if something did crash, what is the obligation of not just the government, but also the press as well to actually say something and actually divulge what that was. Because there are some things are kept secret for a reason, and some things are not fully disclosed for reasons. And it's not just, I know something you don't know. So those were kind of my initial thoughts. One, this is really what we're having congressional hearings about at this point. And two, just again, we'll get into this more, but just because they might have found something doesn't necessarily mean the public has a right to know about it.
Eric, your thoughts?
I feel like Roswell happened at this very particular point in time. And, there were in the summer, kind of spring and summer of 1947, there was this sort of UFO craze, or, all these sightings of flying discs. And I think a lot of it probably was popular consciousness and popular culture, but it was there. And it happened that roughly coincided with what I would consider to be the kind of the first year that was truly the Cold War. And I think we all measure the Cold War as starting at a point in time in 1945. And, certainly as, 1944, 1945, as, the defeat of Germany and Japan became very clear, there was a scramble for the New World Order. And the tensions arose, but those tensions did not happen immediately, right upon those meetings. And I feel like 1947 was one of those. Was that year when things really became tense, and which is why whatever we decide about about that event in Roswell, in this podcast, Project Mogul happened. Like, that was a real thing. And, and whether the events of Roswell were truly a part of Project Mogul, detect, Soviet atomic weapons or not, that's another question. But the program itself was real. And so it provides us a lot of background, a lot of which is really interesting, some plausible deniability, and we can. And I will say that one of my favorite shows growing up was The X-Files. And so we can go full X-Files tonight. Like, I'm down with that.
So you're suggesting the truth may be out there.
The truth is always out there. Like, whatever the truth is always out there.
Cool. Dylan, you're laughing.
Yeah, I just don't know what to make of this. The little science fiction nerd in me that grew up watching Star Wars is just imagining all these sort of. It's going one of two ways. I just don't know which one it's going to go. We're either going to go to like a Robert Heinlein Starship Troopers Warhammer 40K, far future sort of hellscape of doom and misery once we realize aliens exist, or it's going to be kind of an Isaac Asimov, scientific utopia. I have no idea how it's going to go, one way or the other, but it's going to make for some really interesting discussion.
Dylan, I'm giggling in my head, and I think out loud for two reasons. First of all, I have played 40K and own far more little plastic space elves than I would ever care to actually admit to. I was an Eldar player. In fact, if anybody's listening to the podcast, I'm looking to liquidate my army, and it's not small, by the way, because I just don't have the space to store it anymore. So that's one thing that pops into my head. And it's interesting to me that you mentioned Asimov, because, as in the episode a couple of weeks ago, the discussion around, what would American spy novels, or what would spy novels or spies in entertainment in general, that was the Ian Fleming, Ian Fleming dies and John Glenn becomes president. You guys managed to make the butterfly work for all of that when I wasn't there. But this idea of an Asimov type of science fiction, for example, compared to even a Frank Herbert, with Dune reemerging here more recently and in media culture, in a non-David Lynch form, so that it's not it's strange, but it's not that strange kind of form. You mentioned Star Wars. We've had conversations many times on this podcast about Star Trek, because I know a lot of the folks that are part of our team are science fiction fans. But the choice of Asimov to me is very interesting, because of the Apple TV Foundation adaptation, which just finished up its second season, which is, yes, it's that, but it's not. And part of what they did there was actually turn it into something that wasn't as stage play esoteric as Asimov's original Foundation novels were. They're action based now. So Dylan, they can go both places as far as I'm concerned. Is I guess my point is I'm okay with going either place, including the 41st century with a strange emperor of man, Eldar and space orcs, if that's where you want to go, but also along the lines of where Foundation went. I guess the first thing that pops out into my mind, which echoes what Alexis was talking about, and Eric was talking about, and Dylan, what you're talking about there, and what we talked about off podcast, is this idea. The thing that I want to explore is coming off of World War II. This is 47. We are not that far removed from the war at all. And so been a pretty traumatic event. Things are, in some point of returning to normalcy. What do you think would be the public's initial reaction to being told about an alien spacecraft?
Paranoia.
What does that paranoia look like? I mean, are we talking about masses in the streets? Are we talking about people, running to cellars? I mean, it's sort of, War of the Worlds kind of thing. I mean, what does that look like?
Oddly enough, I don't think so. I think this is a 1947 where the population would be paranoid, they would be scared, but they wouldn't, I don't think, push that paranoia towards the government. Because I think this is still a United States where people still fundamentally trust the government. And so I think I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I don't think we would see mass uprisings. I think we would see a population that would be seeking answers from the government. And, if the government is willing to provide those answers to the best of their reasonable ability, I think you would still see stability, but I think there'd be a lot of questions.
Is there hysteria? Is there hysteria, or is there just paranoia, or both?
I don't know the answer to that. Alexis or Dylan, what do you think?
I don't see hysteria. I think it'd be more, I think definitely paranoid. And I think Eric's onto something with saying, it's not hysteria. I see it more as a cautious curiosity, maybe. Mixed with a little bit of paranoia. Yeah, for some reason I'm not seeing. It's funny, the first thing that popped in my head when we started talking about aliens invading with the Daleks from Doctor Who. So I actually had to go and look up when did Doctor Who actually, because I couldn't remember. It was 63. So we're a little while off from that. Because that was hysteria. But for some reason I don't see that. I see lots of questions, and I see a lot of paranoia, but it's a subdued, quiet paranoia, if that makes any sense.
I think so too. I don't see a lot of uprising. I don't see. I see a lot of interest, a lot of questions, but I don't see uprising here. This is not a population that has any interest in rising against a government that they feel is fundamentally has their best interest. I mean, again, we've just defeated Japan and Germany. It is also it's a fairly significant post-war recession, and the Cold War with the Soviets is heating up. This is not really a recipe for domestic unrest.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious what the cultural reaction would be in terms of the Cold War part of it, because obviously, if the American public figures out that aliens are real in 1947, that obviously means that the American military-industrial complex that's developing is going to figure that out too. I think obviously you immediately see something like a retooled United States Air Force or a U.S. Army Air Wing. I don't remember off the top of my head when the Air Force sort of developed, but I'm also curious.
1947.
Oh, perfect. Okay, yeah. So you could imagine that then sort of reframes the entire perspective of how the Air Force develops to eventually, I don't know, not to get too far ahead, but a combined air and space force as a sort of more real, sort of historical agency. But I'm also curious if that would sort of alter the trajectory of the Cold War as it heats up, because starting in the 50s, you start getting some of these last waves of kind of the exploratory ventures that we used to see in the 1800s and the 1900s. Operation Deep Freeze down in Antarctica. They went to go try and see resource extraction. There were some United Nations missions that went down. There were some NATO missions that went to both poles. So I wonder if, instead of sort of a perspective on kind of the last frontiers, you see sort of a perspective shift to go say, okay, well, aliens are real. We need to figure out what else is out there and start turning outwards in terms of a new sort of frontier for the Cold War. Maybe you start having the satellite race heat up a little quicker.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I see that. And the other thing that jumps out at me, invariably you sort of see this in every fictionalized version of this to a degree, Independence Day being one that pops into my head here. And this idea that, this is what will unite mankind because there's an external threat that forces us to realize that we are more alike than we are different. I think there is some truth to that conceptually, right up until the point that it meets reality. And those realities, cannot be as pretty as the fiction is, in the sense that, invariably there's all types of other things that are external threats that, we still squabble over today, that cause that. I see you nodding, Eric. I think you agree with me, right?
Yeah, I have very little problem feeling like that's going to potentially bring the U.S. together, and even though NATO doesn't come around for a couple of more years, it's not hard for me to believe that, kind of a coalescing NATO, of, relatively like-minded Western European and North American powers together into a cohesive unit like that. That's not hard for me to believe, is that, this kind of, pulls people who kind of wanted to be together a little more quickly, especially if we are willing to, share certain amounts of intelligence with those allies. And we probably would, I think we would, with the British, the French, the Canadians, a few others. I don't see huge barriers for us sharing a certain amount of intelligence if we think that benefits us. So I could see us, I could see not necessarily pulling very different groups together than what would have been pulled together in our timeline, but pulling the same groups together a little more quickly and a little faster. I think I could see that. And so you have basically a more aligned NATO. And we can get into, like, I have actually just came up with an idea of a downstream effect of this that would be, helpful for the kind of the long-term scenario in NATO. But I think it pulls people together. I think there's a common goal. Again, if you now know there are extraterrestrials here, then you know that they got here. Now it's possible.
Yeah. And then, ultimately, again, we're speculating here. Again, the speculation of a what if that's not even a real what if in that sense. But, the question is, does the evidence indicate this is a hostile presence? Is the evidence ambiguous? So you just don't know. So now it's, more along the lines of what Dylan was discussing here. We've got to figure this out, science to the rescue. Let's investigate. Let's go. Let's build rockets, instead of them coming here, let's build rockets and let's get out there, kind of scenario, which I could easily see coming along, or whether it's discovered they're not hostile, what does that mean? And I think that matters. Ultimately what you determine, is there a threat, and what is the nature of the threat determines what your response will likely be to it. But the thing that really struck me was something I guess all of you said to a degree, which is it's very difficult for me to look back through the prism of this now because we have our cynical view of government and secrecy and government's, being forthright and what's appropriate for government to keep secret versus what's not. This is only a few years removed from the Manhattan Project, a secret that was kept and was deemed needed. It was hard to keep. Truman sort of becomes vice president, as I've always heard the story, because he was digging into where the money was going, and that was one way to sort of, to co-opt him from continuing to do the research that was there. But generally speaking, in 1947, to your point, Eric, people trust the government. And that's not where we are today. Now, if this were to come out today, it's like, well, why didn't immediately? I think it's the distrust response, I guess, is my point.
Yeah, and I was sorry. Go ahead, Eric.
No. You're good, Dylan. I'm just agreeing with Don. You actually had something to say. Well,
I was thinking that was actually one of the things that struck me is, in this scenario where we have this sort of massive, essentially it's a governmental stewardship of the public trust with this massive, secret that comes out that aliens are real. I think the Freedom of Information Act and sort of its related ilk becomes a much more interesting conversation in terms of it's seen less as, now these days, the Freedom of Information Act and all of those kind of informational sunshine law kind of things, they're seen more as a way to sort of root out corruption in government. But if the Freedom of Information Act, say, gets passed, maybe 10 years earlier in 1956, in the middle of the government trying to figure out how do we responsibly convey all of this information that we may or may not be, extrapolating or figuring out or reverse engineering these alien secrets, how do we handle that? We may end up seeing just an overall public consensus toward a more trustworthy government. And I think if you have something like a Freedom of Information Act that comes earlier, that then lays the groundwork for sort of a more openness to help maybe ease the tensions of the Cold War with the Soviets, because you have, instead of a US government that's seen as sort of withholding secrets and doing, these sort of repeated Red Scares and sort of investigative kind of witch hunts, you can maybe see that they might be seen as being sort of holding the olive branch, so to speak, to kind of let the Soviets, say, hey, look, we're trying to handle this responsibly. We're trying to get this Information Act. So it could potentially ease at least the 1950s portion of the Cold War when it's a lot of information mistrust. I don't know, just a thought I had.
Anything you want to weigh in on, Lex?
Yeah, I think Dylan, I think you're definitely onto something, because I think with the Freedom of Information Act, as we have it in our current timeline, it was definitely kind of like, well, obviously you're hiding something from me, and I want to find out what that information is, because there was that distrust of the government that had built up, which did not exist, a couple years after the end of World War II, and then in the timeline we're talking about. So I 100% agree with you. I think there's a shift in, they're not exactly hiding things from us. It's that they're trying to figure out what they can't even tell us without having to say, like, hey, we think this. 2 years later, they did more research. Oh, never mind. Like it controls the flow of information a little bit better in my head, where it becomes, look, it's not that we're hiding things from you. It's that we're trying to figure out what the heck we can even tell you.
Yeah, it's like a custodial question instead of a withholding question.
Exactly.
It becomes a sort of philosophical political science question that sort of, what is the nature of, the government's ability to handle and disseminate information?
Yeah, it's like, look, I don't even know what to tell you. It's not that I don't want to tell you something. It's that I don't even know what to tell you.
Yeah. Well, and even back to Alexis's original comment, or one of our original comments, there was, this is what we're having hearings about. Part of that idea of what the government may keep secret or what the government may reveal is this appropriate, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, thinking of the government in a form of a parental role, which that's actually a valuable thing and can be a good thing. There's some things, it's okay for mom and dad not to tell you because it actually is appropriate for them not to tell you until you're ready to know kind of things. But what has certainly happened now is that we don't think of government in the United States, and I think hardly anywhere in the world that way. And so our immediate assumption is the reason, to your point, Dylan, and Alexis's point, is we have to have information because things are being withheld from us that we should know for reasons that are, whether they're nefarious or not, they're considered nefarious most of the time. I mean, we assign motive to them even when they don't have the motive. And most of the time, by the way, I think they do have a motive, which is the sad part about what's going on now. Somebody wants to control something.
Yeah.
What also really jumped out at me is that I was really thinking about, I know most of the people I see on the screen here are, and we've talked about this, we've had a number, we're space geeks too, not just science fiction geeks, but space geeks. And, I think of so much of what became the development of what we now know as, space flight technology was around the idea of developing missile delivery technology. Those two things got, connected together in such a way that, yes, we're going to launch satellites, and yes, we're going to send people to the moon, and yes, we're going to do all the other things. But it was not first. My recollection or my interpretation of this, which could be incorrect, is that most of the space program that eventually developed was subservient to the military use of that technology versus being driven first and foremost by the scientific research and desire to go. Is it, if I got that wrong? Do you have a misreading of that, or is that the way you guys think of it too?
No, it was very much a dual purpose effort. No question. And really, and this is when Chris and I were doing some of the episodes together. A couple of things that we explored were how the number one is how the military efforts for missile delivery, missile development, and space travel sort of initiated, and then ended up coalescing in what we call NASA now. So, I mean, I think we have this idea that like there was World War II, and then there was the modern era, or with those of us who grew up in kind of the 50s through the mid 2000s, honestly, would recognize early 2000s. So let's say, Victory in Japan Day in 1945 until 9/11. Like those are some boundaries that I would put on sort of this post, very clear, very specific post-World War II era. And that did not happen overnight. That required some doing. And so I think it required a certain amount of paranoia and interest in keeping up with Soviets, tempered with the idea that we still wanted to explore space. And I'm not even here to tell you that was wrong. Like, I love exploration. I think, I'll be honest to the group here. Like, I tried to join the Navy Medical Corps after college, so they could pay for my training, and because Starfleet wasn't hiring. Like, I'm very much into the idea of exploration in general and exploration of space. And so I think that's a good effort, but at the same time, we lived in a dangerous world. And we won that first battle in that dangerous world, but we didn't know if we were going to win the rest of them. And so, we felt the need to protect ourselves. And, we can armchair quarterback things that happened, almost 80 years ago now. But, we were scared, and we felt like we were in a really vulnerable state. And we felt like we only had a few years of where we were, clearly exclusive with nuclear weaponry, because we knew the Soviets were going to develop it later. We knew that was not a question of if, it was a question of when. And when was 4 years? That was not a long time.
Yeah.
And so we had to put a lot of stuff in place.
Hence Mogul, hence the existence of Mogul, right?
Mogul, and why that existed in 1947. So, I think one of the things that I appreciate about our discussions on A Fork in Time is that we look at this in a modern lens, but also I feel like we are also fairly cognizant, as much as we can be, considering who we are, of what the past looked like. The past was very different, and that we can't always assume modern sensibilities with that, and that the world was a scary place in very different ways.
Yeah, yeah, and there's not that far removed from 47 until what is Sputnik 57? Is it a
57.
decade? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really not that far removed. And the other things that were going on there with high altitude testing, the Air Force was doing, and other things obviously that were leading up to that. But I think we've talked about this before. If you just advance the space race in a good way a couple of years, if you just advance the idea of exploration of space in a couple of years, the way that exponentially plays itself out is we would be decades ahead of where we are now. If you just change the trajectory, probably 2 or 3 years worth back in the late 40s and the early 50s with an eye towards that, trying to understand what's going on. And I can't help, so often now when we think about the space race, again, it was about lift, right? It was about how big a payload could you get up into orbit, which also means how big of a payload could you drop on the enemy, right, via orbit. But think about things like we have now, like the Hubble and the James Webb Space Telescope, which is producing unbelievable science, and some of the other things that we're doing now that are sensing. That comes along really late in the space program and the idea of space. This idea of looking outward even before you can go outward, if that makes any sense. This idea of why would you want to put a telescope in space to get the best possible view? Why would you want to put sensing technology in space to be able to sense things? And if you have a sense that, especially if you don't know what this thing is you found in Roswell, if you have this sense that something is out there, one of the first things you want to do is look out there to figure out what that might be. At least in my head.
Yeah, and I thought I have to do a little pop culture sort of detour for a second, because I can't do a single episode without throwing some kind of weird pop culture reference in there. It's a tradition now. With this kind of sort of focus outwards into sort of, okay, we don't know what's out there, what's coming. I wonder if this sort of kind of like pulp science fiction from the early 40s and 50s, that kind of got all these guys like Heinlein and Asimov and some of the other ones, kind of their early years, where it's all, sort of little green men and terrible B movie, like made for TV, fighting aliens and weird spaceship kind of things. I wonder if that becomes more of the sort of mainline pop culture zeitgeist, almost a paranoia in a certain sense, because of this massive fear of the unknown. Instead of a kind of paranoia of the Soviets in the 50s, it becomes almost a paranoia of space. And I was just happened to look through some stuff. Robert Heinlein actually published 3 months before Roswell a book that was very poorly received, but in this new timeline we're creating, maybe not so poorly received, about how the Nazis had a secret moon base. So there's no telling how the pop culture could decide to go, creating a sort of paranoia that could even, I don't know, encourage more exploration. Just kind of one of those random things.
Well, and I've seen enough History Channel to know that Hitler would have escaped to there. So remember when the History Channel, had history? Never mind. I know we're going way over a lot of our younger listeners' heads.
Well, gosh, I remember those days, and it was all World War II all the time, and so
yeah, it was back when it was called the Hitler Channel.
The Hitler Channel, and I was like, man, I wish we were just learning about World War II on History Channel like it used to be, because I liked learning about history.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, Dylan, because it's not like there wasn't. And there hadn't been before that. Science fiction existed, space science fiction, not just the concept of science fiction, but science fiction existed. But it existed in a weird place that was eventually, advanced to where it later, the branches that it went down. But suddenly maybe it's not the Nazis that have a base on the moon. Maybe that's where this thing at Roswell, came from. So we got to go to the moon, right? We got to go figure out what's there. Even if it's not sending a man there, at least sending something around to the backside of it that can take a picture, because we can't see the backside of it, kind of deal. And I do think that there's this element. I was trying to figure out how this would just be This is my take on how almost anything that's exposed to the public that is major like that happens. Initially, it's a shock, right? For reasons. And this would be shocking news. There'd be questions asked in churches the following Sunday morning. That would be one of the impacts on society rippling through is what does this do to my American patriotism? What does this do to my theology? Suddenly all of thing, would be one of the questions that's being asked. But the amazing thing to me is, some number of weeks and certainly some number of months later, okay, this is now the new fact. And, the shock value wears off, and then it becomes, you move it. I don't know what the stages are that are sort of match the stages of grief, but there's like a shock thing, then there's like an acceptance thing, and then there's like a pragmatic thing that kicks in at some point, just because a pragmatic thing has to start kicking in. And I can't help but think, by sometime by 48, yeah, okay, people are still thinking about the philosophical, theological impact of the fact that there's these creatures that were on a vessel, an alien spacecraft at Roswell. But by 48, it's like, okay, now that we know that, what are we doing about it? Kind of deal versus the other.
And I think we're still asking questions about it, but people are going to work, they're raising their families, they're still going to bowling league. I think that in large part, life is undisturbed. Even though there's other questions, the topics of conversation at bowling league might be different.
Yes.
The topics of conversation at church might be different. And that's
or the astronomy club.
Or astronomy club, so we are having some different conversations. We have internalized a somewhat different reality, even though our day-to-day is very likely not much different. Yeah. And, maybe these are good discussions to have. Maybe these are really healthy discussions to have, but they're different.
Yeah. And I think, where I draw from that, and I try to find application today, is the concept of, we're going to discover something we didn't know at some point again soon, whatever it might look like, whatever it might look. That's the nature of science. It's always uncovering things that we don't know. And what I think this is just my take. You can agree or disagree with me, but it's my take, is we have gotten less pragmatic about what that actually means than we used to be in the past. We've gotten less where we actually would be pragmatic in our response to say, what do we do about this? Because unfortunately, our politics and our society and so much of what's gone on now is we would spend years and months finger pointing about who should have known, who didn't know, what they didn't know kind of thing, versus saying, okay, this is the reality. Now, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think it's, we've become so polarized that now it's not like, okay, this is brand new information, let's move forward. It's like we spend so long dissecting it and pointing fingers that it's like, okay, it's like by the time we get to the point that we're going to do something with the information, it's not new anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
go ahead, Eric.
And I could not agree more, Alexis. And we
found out something else in the meantime because we waited so long to do something with that first piece of new information.
And we talked about this off camera. Is here in A Fork in Time, we are a team of people with a really wide variety of political views, but yet we are also people who have become friends over the experience. And approach our interactions with each other with goodwill. And it would be really nice if the rest of the country could follow suit. So, we are a half a dozen people out of 340 million, but it's one person at a time. One person at a time.
I believe there's more of them out there, Eric. If nothing else,
I think there are too, but I think that the point is well taken, is that I think, once people are willing to discuss with each other with goodwill, I think we find that there's far more that unifies us than what divides us. Yeah. And this is not me running for office, by the way, anybody. I freely admit that I'm unelectable. But the point remains is that there is far more that unites us, and that the hope is that in this different era that would really come forward, is that that in that bowling league, and I'll just and you know I think I introduced my paternal grandfather a couple of weeks ago in the James Bond episode, or well, the Ian Fleming episode, which turned into a James Bond episode. And he was a lifelong Republican, and was not, but at an era where that wasn't what completely defined you. And so, you know, one of his best friends it was a lifelong Democrat who, you know, ran for Congress in the 90s, who my grandfather supported because he knew he was a good person.
Yeah.
And, you know, we didn't necessarily agree on every, you know, aspect of it. You know, we had some, you know, I know they had some very fierce debates as friends, but at the end of the day, they knew each other were a good person. And so they supported each other in their entire careers. And I worked for his friend. I worked for his, you know, when he ran for Congress in Kansas in 1996. And, you know, you know, my grandfather was still, at the end of the day, he was a Republican, but he was Irish Catholic. They worked for Kennedy in 1960.
Yeah.
Because you know, so it was a different time.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, when I first thought about this as a topic, I was like, okay, you know, where is this mythical what if going to happen? Roswell seemed like the logical place because it's in culture the way that it is and other things that are there. But, you know, I could have put it at any other point, you know, in history. And I think as long as you're before, certainly if you're pre-Watergate, you know, that we talk about that so often as being a watershed in terms of the level of trust for the government and other things that are there. You know, I think generally speaking, as long as it's pre-Watergate and still in the Cold War era where there was the concern about the government is looking out for me because there is something that I have to be fearful of, and it's, you know, it's an opposing ideology, espoused by another global superpower. There's a long period of time from 47 on forward. I think that a lot of things we've talked about are true. If we were to interpose this today, it would just be very different. You know, so something happened at some point along the way in terms of how it was interpreted. And you know, even interesting to me, because even these, I mentioned it sort of in the intro, these UAP hearings that Congress had and other things there. There's even some politics and finger pointing going on inside of that where, you know, it's strange to me. There is some across party lines there. It's like, you know, we didn't understand what this is. It doesn't matter. This is not a Democrat or Republican thing. But even inside of that, we've seen that creep up, which is the part that, you know, just astonishes me is that, you know, I think we were talking off podcast about former President Obama's appearance on like a late night show or something like that. And he was being asked about this. And he said, oh, I'm not going to talk about the aliens or just things I can and can't talk about. He said, but what I can talk about openly, and I'm not being, you know, funny or whatever here, is that we have video of things, we witness things we can't explain. Just flat out, we can't explain it. That's why they're, you know, unidentified. That's why they're phenomena. And his point was, we need to figure out what it is. Wherever that leads, we need to figure out what that is. And I think that would have definitely been the case in 47. I don't think it's the case in 2023. And that says something to me.
I agree.
I know this has been a weird one. I knew there was going to be a strange one. Even Dylan said, I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know if it's gone to where it all wants to go, but I'm going to go around really quick for any last closing thoughts. And I'm actually anxious and curious to see, for those of you that haven't joined our Discord servers, I know that we have that. It's starting to heat up again now that we have episodes going out and there's some fun stuff happening there. So I'm actually curious to see what the AFIT-averse in Discord says about this when they hear this one. So Eric, I'll start with you. Any last closing thoughts on this before we close it out?
No, I think this has been a really good discussion, and I agree. I think our Discord server can give us some inspiration and some perspective. And one of the segments we could put in you know, future podcasts is you know, what was the reaction of our Discord server? Like, you know, where do people think we got it wrong or right last time? And if anybody has anything that we think is pretty insightful, like, let's talk about it. Like,
I think that's a good idea.
I think that could be really fun. And also, Don, another live cast would be really fun, or live stream. That would be fun.
I'm looking forward to that. In fact, I even threw out on the Discord server today, just asking folks, you know, we have to figure out sort of when this works, you know, a day a week, time of day kind of thing to get the best participation. So if you haven't weighed in on that, either by going to the website and give us suggestions back there, there's plenty of places to do feedback for that at www.aforkintime.com, but also in the Discord server more in real time. We interact with it, which is my favorite part about that. It's us interacting with the folks. Dylan, any magical thoughts? I know we missed something. You've got a nugget that I know we just stepped over.
The only thing that I can think of is that hopefully in this alternate space oriented or space focused universe that we've created, there are more than 3.5 seasons of Star Trek. It becomes more of a initial cultural mainstay, not just a long term cultural mainstay. That's really all I got.
That's fair enough.
I'm done with that.
Yeah. It doesn't. Phase 2 doesn't become. We've done whole episodes of that, and I'm happy to go back there again anytime as well. And we can always talk about the interesting here in lots of air quotes there personality that is Gene Roddenberry. That's a whole thing. That's a room I don't know if I want to be in where it happened, to be honest with you guys, but still there. Lex, any closing thoughts?
No, I think we covered everything. This was fun. Yeah, I didn't know where this was going, but this was fun.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things about gathering together the team is that we can. We probably should do it less frequently. We probably should be a little bit better prepared for sometimes, but we don't always know what the topic's going to be. Although we're lining again some good stuff up. Just to give that preview again, I think I did in the last episode as well. As we relaunch the room where it happened, our plan is to be in Rome, in the Curia Julia, which is not the only place the Senate ever met. In fact, it's a latecomer in terms of where the Senate met, but talking about the idea of Rome, and then connect that to A Fork in Time episodes. It occurred to me, I was going to say this to you guys, there's more than 3 of us here, but I know, Dylan, you've talked and suggest I know we'll have some things on the various triumvirates that grew there. And I was thinking about trios throughout history. And invariably, when I think about Roman triumvirates, I'm sure we'll talk about it on that episode, there's always a weak link in the 3, right? In terms of there's always like 2 and then somebody that's just along to be the 3rd. And I was reminded of that old adage about poker. If you sit down at the table and you're looking for the dead money, and if you can't figure out who the dead money is, it's probably you. And, sometimes when I'm looking around on the podcast screen here, I'm like, okay, who's the wink link here? I think I might be the wink link here. So, so there we go. But good stuff there as well. I just want to mention to our listeners, again, I mentioned a couple of times, we do have the website, a place to go give us topical suggestions and feedback. I like your idea a lot, Eric, of incorporating some of the feedback that we get on the Discord server. So, it's tough to have a conversation in a one-way audio medium like a podcast, but it is possible to do that when you have a community and you make an effort of circling back around to it. And we definitely will get a live stream done sometime this fall. When that's going to be, I don't know, but it's going to happen. And my real goal for that, I've thought about a lot of things about what that could be. One of that would be to actually do an episode like this, where a topic is known ahead of time and we throw it out so the folks know what they're coming for the live stream, but have that live interaction where folks can jump in and be part of the expanded team and what's there, with the exception of Alexis, who, comes to the podcast a different way. Everybody else that's on the podcast now came to the podcast normally starting as a guest, even if they were somebody that I knew or otherwise. And I think we got some more talent out there. I think we got some more team members out there. We just haven't found them all yet, which is the other thing that's pretty cool. So for Dylan, Alexis, and Eric, this is Don signing off for this episode of A Fork in Time. Lex, you're on the podcast, so I have to throw this to you. If someone should happen across a fork in time, do we have any suggestions for them?
I think they should take it.
I like that idea. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.